Mr. Porgins, followed by, someone have to use my, Mary Ann King.
Madam Chairman, members of the board, my name is Patrick Porgans, Porgans and Associates, and I'm here representing a couple of different clients. And we got to get the numbers straight here. California's agriculture uses 80% of the developed water and the water that's available to it. The North Coast area, you know, which we don't have a lot of dams there to capture the water, is the water they're usually talking about for fish and for public trust resources. So 80% is a pretty solid number. I came here and I talked to you about the almonds, if you remember. Forgive me about the glasses, I'm not incognito, I just can't take the light. I came here and I talked to you about the almonds. I told you they increased almonds from between 2010 to 2012 by 40,000 acres a year. Since then, they've increased it another 40,000 or so. They're increasing almond orchards, they're putting new orchards up in Sonoma County right now. Something people need to understand. Napa, Sonoma is wine country, okay? It's another country. They operate in a vacuum up there. I've been in that area for about 10 years. I have some understanding of how things work. Anyway, getting to the drought-related emergency. Am I in control here with this? Is it the red button? No. The right button? Okay, so anyway, the drought emergency is supposed to, you know, enhance water conservation and provide additional information, you know, to help specific species up there in that basin. Well, that's a great idea. I'm all for it. The problem is that we've known for a long time, and I'm talking 50 years ago, that we've had declines in salmonid species in that particular reach, as in the rest of the state of California. That's just a fact. And by the way, when I'm handing you numbers, they're not my numbers, they're the government's numbers, so I don't take responsibility for that. So moving along, what we're looking at here, and I'll get back to the decline in species in a minute. In the fact sheet, it states, you know, on page 2, that residents, businesses, including wineries, would be involved in the conservation measure. Well, we come to find out that under section 51201, we are exempting agriculture. Now, as far as I'm concerned, unless they have a lawn or some ornamentals, then they have to comply. Well, if the figures people are throwing around here as to how much water these grapes are using, I have to tell you that you're going to have to have a lot of lawns in order to make up the difference between that and the amount of water applied to grapes. It may also interest you to know that grape production has increased from 2012, from 2010 to 2014, from 835,000 acres to 865,000 acres. Okay, so they just keep on growing. So the next thing is that I wanted to get clarification about the applicability to agriculture, but now we know that they're not that elephant is not recognized in the room. So moving along, the board, under section 876C1, it states the board has the authority to ensure the protection and preservation of streams and limit diversions, you know, to protect these species. Well, we've acknowledged you have that authority for a long time. I've been coming here for decades telling you that. So, you know, this idea of coming in here and saying, you know, we have this authority, well, yeah, but unfortunately, wasn't really ever exercised that much. Now we have a situation where you're coming in with the unreasonable use. Well, wine grapes, that's a controlled substance. It's also been known to be a carcinogenic, huh? So we're putting, you know, like, my Lord turned water into wine. We're turning wine, we're taking the water to make the wine. I mean, you know, how much wine do we need? By the way, I don't drink. So anyway, moving along here. As I said, 50 years ago, in the 1980s, government developed a plan to double anadromous fisheries in the Russian River. Okay? So that's another failed plan. Okay, the public record attests that the unmitigated threats to salmon in the Russian River are primarily the responsibility of massive agricultural diversions, primarily grow grapes. I mean, when they talk about California being nuts and grapes, I mean, they've got it right. So we worked up there for about a decade. I put in satellite and radio telemetry to do monitoring in the Mark West Creek with some of my former clients. It was one of the most advanced systems that existed, plus 24/7 video. I tried to get some money to get that done, and I was told that I would be putting people out of jobs. Yeah, in the government. This is Mark West Creek, the headwaters, and you can see how denuded that land is up there. And that was back in 2000. I mean, so they're taking all that recharge area, plus they're increasing the sediment loads, which is then creating more problems in relationship to the survivability of the species. And as long as that continues, I mean, I don't care what you do. You can trickle it in, trickle it out. It's not going to help the fish. So anyway, moving along, and I'm almost done. And I appreciate the fact that, you give me a little time here. The emergency issue, it has to be justified in some way, shape, or form. And I don't see where we're justifying that at this point, and I'll give you some reasons for that in a moment. And I agree with O'Loughlin and Paris regarding the unreasonable doctrine. I don't believe that it should be inclusive in this drought regulation. Now, we got a reality check on water conditions in the North Coast region. And according to the California Department of Water Resources, and this is the Bulletin 120 series, this is their latest bulletin, this is the May 1st forecast. It appears from the data that the North Coast region received 85% of its precipitation for the water year. And also it shows that in the California data, CDEC, that Warm Spring dams is 90% of average. And that the Coyote Dam, which are both on the Russian River, is at 70% of average. There's the map. It says 85% up there. That's not one of those areas we get a lot of snow. That's precip. It's precip. So if you look at back in history, and we've had droughts and we continue to have droughts. The problem is the margin of cushion that we've once had is gone. It's gone. So when we get into these dry cycles, then we get into this situation you're experiencing now. So it puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on everybody. I've come here for decades and I try to make that point to you. And and I'm not here to criticize you. I'm just here to let you know I've got 40 years in this. I'm letting you know that from my point of view, and from looking at the data, and there's the Warm Spring data if you wanted to see it on the Russian River. It's right there. It says 90% of average for this time of year and 70% Coyote. So the conclusion is, and this is based on the facts. If you want to hold an evidentiary hearing, I'm available, and I'll prove everything that I have to say, and I'll bring you the documents to support it. That's just how I am. So in conclusion, the board and the governor's collective actions have leading up to the drought proclamation in 2014, has exacerbated the drought. And nature's part of that. But the predominant issue is that it's a government-induced, what I'm saying, water mismanagement cabal. You've over-appropriated the waters of the state by hundreds of millions of acre-feet. So you can't tell me how much water anybody is actually taking. We don't know enough about where we are. But we do know we got to do something about it. And I'm saying to you, this is what I'm sharing this with you. I'm sharing. You've got to do something about agriculture. And I mean, you've got to do something soon. So anyway, as I said, I'm available to provide you and share the information to bring this thing into perspective anytime you're ready. And I take exception to these workshops and these emergency meetings. We live in a state that's been here for a while, and it's going to be here for a little longer. And if we don't do things to take the measures necessary, we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves. And that'll be tragic for the people's children to come. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Marianne King.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Marianne King. I'm on staff with Trout Unlimited. Trout Unlimited works up and down the coast with landowners and water users on cooperative projects to benefit in-stream flow, including in the Russian River, where we're a member of the Russian River Coho Water Resources Partnership. So Trout Unlimited supports the proposed regulation, and we believe that both mandatory and voluntary action are going to be necessary given the extent of the drought, the dire nature of coho, and also the low flow in the tributaries. I heard someone say the other day that spring is the new fall in the Russian River tributaries, which is funny and also sad. So I wanted to offer 3 comments. The first is that I would urge you, along with considering the proposed regulation, to also consider the extent you can support voluntary action. Many water users in the Russian River tributaries have done projects that have benefited in-stream flow in Coho and Steelhead. There are other projects in the pipeline, and we have projects that we're developing right now. Those projects run the gamut from efficiency projects to roof water harvesting and collection to offset summertime diversions, to storage and forbearance projects with winter storage under new appropriative rights and dedications of in-stream flow in the summer, to reducing acreage to reservoir releases. And a lot of them go well beyond what the voluntary drought initiative agreements would require of anyone and what this regulation would require of anyone. And so I guess I would urge you to support that action by expediting permitting to the extent that you can, by dedicating funding to the extent that you can, and then also by preserving and creating incentives for people to do good work. And I think about this particularly in the context of if curtailments are on the table, creating a way for folks to take action on a short-term or a long-term basis that gives them some incentive. So could you create a carve-out for someone who does something good if curtailments come down the line? So that's my carrot spiel. The second comment that I have is that I urge you to adopt the proposed regulation as is, including the informational order. But I also want to acknowledge that the informational order is going to be a heavy lift for a lot of people. And I think that anything that you can do to accompany that with technical assistance and resources is going to be really important. I appreciate the documents that staff have prepared, and I think that they're great. And I think that the workshops will help. But I think that even beyond that, anything that you can commit in terms of resources and technical assistance, I think will pay off in terms of the ability of people to comply, in terms of the quality of the information that you may get, which I think is really what is important is, the information that you can gather will be, I think, directly proportional to the amount of time that and support that people feel like they have in responding to this. And then my third comment is that I would urge you to, this is beyond, I think, the context of this meeting and your agenda for this meeting, but I would urge you to think about adopting a similar type of regulation for other coastal streams and to do so because, in part because urban water users have already been subject to a lot of the restrictions that are in the conservation component of this. And I know it's an enhanced conservation order, but I think that the urgency that this demands and the situation that Coho are in, I think really call for thinking about other places where at least the conservation component of the regulation could do a lot of good to leave a small trickle, and it's not a lot of water in streams for Coho, and I think that would be worthwhile. So thank you for your time and for your consideration of my comments.
Thank you. Thanks all very much. I want to turn to my colleagues for questions, comments. I have a bunch, but my guess is we'll cover much of the same ground. So whoever wants to go first. You two have been out there the most, so whichever of you wants to start.
Yeah, I'll just do one and then pass along. This actually, those comments about the importance of voluntary efforts hit home with me. I think the more we can structure this into the regulation, the better. I know we've tried to do that with other of these emergency regulations. So as we look at the proposed language in page 3 of the regulation, and the bottom of the page is subsection 5 under D. That's the language, I believe, in this regulation that tries to create this hierarchy that if you've got a voluntary agreement, you're not subject to the regulation directly. Though we've heard that there's still hovering in the background the accountability of the regulation. So as you look at this language, and we put the burden on Department of Fish and Wildlife and NIMS to make the determination that the voluntary program is at least equivalent. So really the question is probably more for Fish and Wildlife and NIMS, is that with these out-of-the-box, watershed approaches like the off-stream reservoir and the appropriative right that's used to do pulse flows, and as an example, are these other initiatives that landowners have embarked on that make a difference in a voluntary context. Do you see a pathway through the language we've proposed to be able to tell landowners that those efforts and others, not just that example, meet the intent and are somehow functionally equivalent to meeting the regulatory requirements that we've laid forth for, I guess at this point, conservation, but maybe in the future, any curtailments?
Well, we would hope to put into any other voluntary agreements, and what we've seen in other areas when you did pass an emergency regulation is that then people were more interested in our voluntary agreements after the emergency regulation. So we are hoping that if you do pass an emergency regulation, we will get more voluntary agreements, and we expect that to happen. We're ready for that. We're excited about that. Because we worked with the board staff so that our current landowner one does meet the requirements that it's the floor of the regulation, and then we have access. So if there are some other things that we can do, Gallo and others having actual releases, we'll continue to look at the floor of the regulation and how we can work that into being able to say that it meets that floor and is satisfactory. But we hope to see the emergency regulation passed. We'll try to continue to structure our voluntary agreements so that we can say that it meets this floor and is sufficient.
I've asked most of my questions, but maybe Mariana can go through some language changes that she worked on with Mr. Sawyer on 2 points that I raised. One was on the issue of wanting to provide information in the resolution regarding residential use, and some sense that there's quite a bit of residential use. And so she's got some language that, are you ready to pull it up?
Yes. Janine, do you think you could put it up on the screens, please? Thank you.
And that's item 13, I think, right?
Right. First, we'd look at the
Public trust. You want to do
It will
public
probably appear as renumbered in this one because of the changes that we discussed for earlier in the document as well.
And the other issue has to do with resolution, let's see, whereas clause number 10. I had some questions about, this is not a public trust action, and so I was looking for some clarification on that, and I believe you've got some language on that as well.
Right. It might be easiest if it's hard to find in the document I sent over, to start with the page, so the next page that has number 9 at the top, or the page after that. Yeah. So the first change that we discussed is clarification to the resolution. The regulations are being adopted under the doctrine of waste unreasonable use. That's what Water Code Section 1058.5 grants us the authority to adopt emergency regulations under. It's one of the several. And Board Member Diadamo wanted some clarification that the reason we were discussing the National Audubon Society case is that that is part of the reasonableness balancing, not that this is an exercise of the public trust doctrine. And so we merged former paragraph 10 and former paragraph 11 together so that the paragraph 10 appears in the context of the reasonableness paragraph. And we added the text, in applying the reasonableness doctrine, the state water board has a duty, and that should be to consider.
So
I
you're
don't know if you
putting
can
it
add that in.
in there, but you're putting it there in context versus it hanging out by itself.
Exactly, and we also
Obviously,
slightly,
it exists, but yeah.
right, and we slightly changed the language from the balancing test as expressed. The language in former paragraph 10 is a direct quote from National Audubon Society, and this, I think by stepping back a bit from that language, clarifies that we're talking about the public trust doctrine as one of the considerations under reasonableness. So do you want to discuss that now or move to the next change at this point? Okay. If you don't mind my reading it through entirely for the record, what this is, it's a deletion of former paragraph 10 and then inserting into former paragraph 11, new paragraph 10, after the close of the citation of Tulare District v. Lindsay Strathmore District, the text, in applying the reasonableness doctrine, the State Water Board has a duty to consider the state's public trust resources, including fisheries, period, and then adding a citation to National Audubon Society versus Superior Court, the 1983 Supreme Court case. Okay, and so then that would then renumber the rest of the paragraph. So if we go to new paragraph 12, the next proposed change is the additional information that Board Member Diadamo asked to emphasize regarding the extent of residential use in these watersheds. And it's adding a citation from O'Connor Environmental, Mr. O'Connor spoke here, about the estimates on Green Valley Creek, and also notes that CDFW in their investigations has noted that many of the riparian diversions that they have seen are to residences alongside the creek. So it adds the text after the first sentence of new paragraph 12. For example, on Green Valley Creek, O'Connor Environmental estimates that 42% of groundwater demand is for non-agricultural use, and CDFW reports that many surface riparian diversions are for ornamental turf and landscaping.
How can you prove that?
So,
How can you prove that? It's ridiculous. Throwing in percentages that make no sense. You just toss them out.
so the citation to the report that the 42% is drawn from is in the digest, and I can also hand it to you later after the meeting if you're interested. Additionally, it's in the PowerPoint presentation that CDFW presented.
And if I can add, I think Dr. O'Connor has left, but I did check with him on that number prior to the hearing, and it is an estimate that could be improved with increased information available, but they did look at amount of vineyard acreage and had a water duty associated with that for frost. They looked at the number of frost days over a period of years to get those other relative numbers, And then with the residential, the basic per capita use is based on data records from the city of Sebastopol, which is in or near that watershed, and then extrapolated to the number of residences in the area that they're looking at. So there was a methodology associated with it. It may have some inaccuracies associated with because of necessary assumptions, but it wasn't just pulled out of thin air.
No, thank you. Go ahead.
I was going to ask Member Diadamo, I assuming this is a change that you requested. I'm curious as to your thinking as to the merits and the importance of including this citation. I'm a bit uncomfortable at signaling out one number provided by one consultant or one expert, recognizing that a different one may have a different number, and so I'm a bit uneasy about this change.
I'm not wedded to the language. What I was looking for was a way to, the testimony that we saw today illustrates the challenge out on the ground that, people pointing fingers at other uses. And so looking to get, in light of the fact that right now we're focused on a conservation order that does not include irrigated agriculture, looking for a way to have some information as to why we are doing that. And we know we're doing that because we have information from our staff and from the fish agencies that there's a fair amount of a draw that's coming from that sector. But we don't, if you read through the order, we don't have that information in the order. So it doesn't, I don't feel strongly about that language in particular.
I would agree with you that including some language, and it's evident, I think, in the record and what we've heard today in comments that we've received, that this is an important area for us to focus on. And I'm hoping that we can convey that without signaling out one number from one consultant.
Member Doda and Member Diadamo, I think part of what we're trying to gain through the informational order is in fact information on where the water use is occurring, how much is occurring, how much is projected. And I think we could potentially just work in some general statements as an alternative to the fact that there are various sectors of water use out there, and each of them, may contribute. And but we're focusing here on the areas of water use that are the easy ones to get to immediately, that may have a significant draw, and just do general language along those lines. Because I think part of what the information order is intending to do is really get at what is the use now and projected.
So you'll take another crack at this language?
I think the preceding sentence already includes the generalization that this conservation regulation will achieve significant savings. So I actually think you can delete it and it still works. If you want to add back up, which is what Board Member Diadamo was looking for, we can look at drafting that, but I really think you can just delete it.
And I have a suggestion, because there's a lot in terms of direction that I'd like to suggest here, and that a lot of it does have to do with messaging, which doesn't need to be in here other than direction to staff to do it. And I know this is always our challenge. I mean, I do think at the heart of some of this is everybody doesn't become a water expert, and I actually completely understand the reaction of some of the speakers, and I want to thank Ms. Maurice and Mr. Ritchie for actually coming, given the fact that the notice is so challenging, both on something like this, but also just in terms of the emergency we face. And in some ways, I think putting them both together, although I think time is of the essence, makes it challenging, because it's not as if we can just say, oh, grapes by. I mean, we don't have the authority to pick on a particular use like that. What we're doing here is saying we're in an emergency. We need to get some water fast. Summer's upon us. It's going to dry up. And conservation, as we've been messaging all year, 2 years practically, is the sort of cheapest, fastest, smartest way to go to buy us a little bit of time. Curtailments are hitting ag not based on what they grow, but based on what their water rights are. Here in this particular watershed, because of this heavy interconnectedness, we have a paucity of information that's different than what we have in other areas, and getting at it is challenging. By the same token, SGMA, the groundwater management legislation, just got passed, gave some tools to locals, finally for the first time in 100 years, put some responsibilities on locals to actually manage that overall community use of water, where the issues of vineyards versus residents and new development versus existing development are going to be duked out all over the state in a thoughtful process. But we don't get to step in and do the job of the locals, nor do we get to pick as between economic uses of water that readily. But we do get to focus on watering lawns and conservation. So I mean, we've been spending years on this. I completely understand and suspect we'll have all kinds of confusion in the community. I'm glad you're going to be doing those outreach meetings. I personally would have preferred if we could have done them before. I agree with the speakers. That's a better way to do it. And I agree with Mr. Roger. You're going to have people who have a negative reaction or just as angry and not going to be in a frame to listen to the explanations that you're valiantly going to try to make. And doing that in a very focused way, also acknowledging that, I think is going to be very important. So I'm torn because I'm uncomfortable with, as you know, you guys do a really good job at outreach, and we've been trying to, I think among agencies we do a good job. In this one, it feels terrible, but the choice isn't to let the fish die. So I think we need to emphasize that piece of it, and then come up with some way to say, for example, you know, to highlight the voluntary agreements, et cetera, to say we won't be taking enforcement for a while so that you do have time to communicate with people. I'm just worried if we put it off for a long time, by then we won't, the fish will be gone. Right, exactly. But also on the information order, while we could give you the authority, I obviously wouldn't want that information order to go out until there's been a lot more engagement. Because it just seems to me the information we're going to get in the information order might be helpful in curtailments this year, but it might not. Given that complexity of the groundwater, surface water interaction, we'll see when we see what we get and what we can get from everybody else. So I just think there's a messaging challenge here that's challenging, and I think it's got to include, I don't know if the word is apology, but acknowledgement of it. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm not so uncomfortable that I want to condemn the fish. So, and again, all intentions I know are very good, but it's a challenging situation to be in. But I think a pretty big messaging and communication challenge that we have. I do have one question for our Fish and Wildlife folks, if you can answer it on this, because again, I know you talked about going out to try and get your voluntary agreements, and you got very little feedback. But I don't know that you sent letters to the same 10,000 people. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you tried to do, just so I can really understand it. And then I'd like to hear about your engagement with the vineyards, because again, at a commercial level, they, you know, might only take a few of them to get a bunch of water. And I think it's completely understandable and legitimate for the residential community to say, hey, we've been here for a long time. These vineyards are coming in and soaking up and dewatering is the word that's been used. That's true. And the system that we have had in the state, and which will evolve out of with the passage of the groundwater legislation, has allowed for that over time. So I think it's a fair point that they're raising. So I would like to hear what you've tried to do to deal with them, because eventually we'll get to them, but we only have the curtailment tool, which is not picking on a particular user for what they use, but looking at them first in time, first in right. Sorry, there are a lot of comments.
I know,
here.
I was trying to,
The
I
question
should
is,
have been
what
taking
your
notes, my
outreach,
apologies.
Your outreach efforts to residential have been, and your outreach efforts to the vineyards.
Well, to start, we sent a total of 650 letters, and the way we came up with that number is we went through and we actually just targeted parcels that were immediately adjacent to the creek, just riparian parcels. So we weren't really looking at that time, we weren't really looking at the groundwater issue. We sent letters to all of the watersheds except for Mark West Creek in the fall of last year. Then we sent subsequent letters to all of the watersheds in the spring of this year, and scheduled 2 outreach meetings, one in the Green Valley, Dutch Bill area, and then one in the Mark West Creek, Mill Creek area. Pardon? Well, the outreach meetings were actually for all, any landowners of interest, and we came across the same issue where unfortunately there were several landowners that did not receive notice from us. You know, unfortunately, we're looking at APM numbers and things along that line. It's just difficult. It was difficult for us, but what we did do is we posted flyers in local areas and pretty much invited anybody in the watershed community to come in and talk with us. The Voluntary Drought Initiative program is also not necessarily restricted to those 650 landowners or parcels. We've actually offered, and not only is it offered throughout the watershed, but we're also looking at, as I mentioned earlier, the only one we got in 2014 isn't even in those 4 watersheds. It was in a completely different tributary. One thing to clarify that 42% number is that the 42% was actually calculated in the entire Green Valley Basin, and we're actually looking at these upper tributaries. And one of the things that you'll see is that possibly there is some correlation with the fact that there aren't very many vineyards in these upper watersheds, and that may be one of the reasons why we do have perennial flow at this time. So, I mean, we do understand that in some cases, and unfortunately this does happen to us a lot, we're kind of focusing on the people that have historically been managing their water better than most people, and because of their good actions, they're the people that have the fish in their backyard. Sadly, that's just kind of how it works for us sometimes. But we have been talking with the agricultural industry, the Farm Bureau, and talking about ways that they could help assist some of the small residential landowners, and that's where the tank program came into play. One of the biggest questions or complaints that we got, well, I think like the first 10 phone calls we got in response to the letter was, yeah, hey, I think it's great. I'd love to put a tank in. Where's my money? I can't afford it. Can you give me money to do it? And, you know, at that point, we started trying to figure out a way to do that. Unfortunately, the grants program, that cycle was not going to provide funding in a timely manner. We are encouraging people to apply for those types of funds in the future, but those will not be implemented this season. There's also Prop 1 funds that are coming up. So there's lots of funding opportunities coming up in the future. They're just not coming up next week. And that's really when we need to be acting. And then there's also permitting issues. We do have, for example, a project in Dutch Bill Creek that is exactly the type of project that we're looking for, where they have a direct diversion in Dutch Bill Creek, and they received funds from us and others to place tanks for storage in a spring, so that they wouldn't have to actually divert directly from the creek during the midsummer. And they're currently in the process of waiting for their water right permit to go through the system. Unfortunately, they didn't qualify for any of the expedited processes. So the drought has provided us a lot of opportunities to get creative and to think out of the box. I don't think we would have ever gotten any of these flow enhancement projects off the ground if it weren't for the drought. But there are still constraints that we really don't have much control over.
Question. Why wouldn't the permitting that you're talking about be expedited through the Water Board, through the Division of Water Rights? I mean, it just seems to me with this being such a priority that we should also have a priority review process similar to what Fish and Wildlife has on that, well, I can't remember the name of the program. Put it down here.
Thank you, Dee Dee. I was just trying to get the specifics of the information from the staff that's working on that. We prioritize the fishery projects as the highest kinds of projects right after the temporary urgency change petitions when we have communities running out of water that need to change their water right permits. And we've been primarily working on those for the last several months. That particular one, though, what we're finding is often when people come to us for an application, they make other changes besides that one that would go through quickly. And I don't know, maybe Corey knows the specifics of this one. My guess is it got held up because they wanted to do, why they were there, do other things, or make other changes in location or something else that are problematic, or they have protests from others in the area. So I don't know the specifics of that one. That'd be my guess. But they are the highest priority after keeping communities in water this year.
And we do have this small domestic and small irrigation programs, but it sounds like this exceeds the size for that.
I would just point out too that putting a tank in this year isn't going to help us this year in any case. So the permitting process is really sort of a between now and next year sort of an issue, as opposed to the urgency is issue.
And I was just going to say there's a similar instance with the Gallo project where they're basically saying that they're not going to be able to release water this year because their permit issues have not been resolved and they'd be out of compliance. And part of it is, I think it's probably being held up in the way Barbara was mentioning because they are asking for, I don't remember the specifics, but they need water sufficient to maintain their operations. And so they're not just saying we're going to give this water up. They want to be able to recoup it for their frost protection needs.
Well, that's a fair amount of water, and I've talked with Mr. Howard about it. Unfortunately, he's not here to respond, but he informed me that that would be expedited. So maybe we need to talk offline.
And that is definitely, yes, everything is being expedited all at once, unfortunately, but that we are very aware that that one is one that is a high priority.
We'll follow up on it and get back to you on the status.
In terms of the resolution and for the regulation, I want to make sure that we have changed the item 1 on page 1A, purpose of this section, the gray water, that we have actually made a change to say gray, well, yes, untreated rainwater. We can say on-site, but I'm okay with untreated rainwater and gray water.
Right, that will require 7 changes, and we, Ms. Townsend.
Okay. The second thing is, it's my understanding that residences are already under the prohibitions that are being listed.
So,
correct?
Under the statewide conservation regulations that have been in effect and are continuing,
right.
All Californians are subject to the end user restrictions. The enhanced conservation requirements under these emergency regulations extends those restrictions to include both potable and non-potable water uses, and the water use. And there are a few additional restrictions that are added in, but statewide, all Californians are subject to the end user restrictions currently in effect.
Well, in terms of communicating, I think we should start with what everyone is required to do anyway. It may be part of this this regulation, but it's a requirement already. And that, I mean, I think a number of people will be reacting to something and saying, I don't want to do this, or I want to talk about it, but it's already required. And so I just want to make sure that, particularly in our outreach, because I looked through the fact sheet, and it was not clear to me that that there is already a requirement, particularly for residential folks to be stepping up. They're doing it all over the state, and so I just want to draw that to your attention because I think that's important. And
can I just follow on to that? I just want to make sure it's clear that the folks within the area affected by the regulation that you're considering now, there is the additional application of those restrictions to non-potable water, but they are also enhanced. So the ability to save your lawn, unless you have sources of untreated or gray water, is going to be
beyond the existing regs.
Exactly.
For everybody, yes.
Right. No, I understand that. But if someone is a resident in this area and they have lawns, they are under certain restrictions already that are quite strong. And then this is essentially adding some to that. But I guess what I think might happen when you go out, when we all go out to talk with people, is that they're going to think that they can essentially discuss all of these activities. Well, they can discuss perhaps some of them. Well, actually, they won't be able to discuss them very anyway. But most of them, there's no discussion. It's required. And so I just want to be absolutely clear as to what is already 100% required and what is special to this area. And the last thing is to what is the effect, particularly in the information order, of the emergency nature of the order? There's some time restrictions on how long this will last, and therefore how long we have to gather the information. Is that correct? Even if we gave extensions.
Yes, as an emergency regulation, this would be in effect for 270 days from approval by the Office of Administrative Law and filing with the Secretary of State. If the board chooses to readopt the emergency regulation either during that time or at a later date, it would be essentially reconsidering the entire package and could make changes. You experienced this recently when you readopted the emergency water conservation regulation on March 17th and then reconsidered and readopted it on May 5th with significant changes. Unless something as significant as an executive order directing you to make significant changes to what you're potentially going to do right now comes up in the next 270 days, I would anticipate that this would run its course before being reconsidered, unlike that situation. But certainly the requests for information, as Barbara Evoy already mentioned, would go out relatively near term after outreach has happened, so that if people got extensions, they would still be looking at responding during the term of the regulation. But if the requirement to respond is in place, then certainly we expect people will be responding for that.
My final, I'm looking at this sentence, and I hesitate to put people in a position of having to defend a number that they, don't really, that, as you said, just comes from one source. So I think we really should.
Okay with taking it out.
Take that out.
I do think in the communication, and you can tell me, Karen or Andy, how to put it in as direction. I think it's I mean, there's an extra hurdle to get over because of this procedural thing, a big one. And I think the speakers were right to be irritated and angry and are right that this is absolutely not the way we like to do things, but we're faced with an emergency here. I think the communication is going to be essential to any success, because I do think, and I appreciated the concern about fish. This is not a day where we've had fish versus people, thank heavens, and it's about how do we get there. But I think if we postpone action, it's saying we can't do anything. And so I think that puts an incredible burden on all of you and an expectation, I think, from us that you are going to have to be extra good at these outreach meetings and much better materials and all that explain, you know, the basis for the relative amounts. Water rights are going to have to be explained, not the full tome, but what we can do and what we can't do, as opposed to what my Aunt Charlotte or a regular person would think is, we're going into a context of conflict between the growth of an industry and the water it uses and the people who've been there a long time. I think that's challenging. We don't have all the tools to deal with it that we would like, and I think we should be, or that may, you know, depends on what you think about the system. I think we need to be honest about that, and I think we're going to need to explain what SGMA does and what the ability and the responsibilities of local governments are at the moment and what ours aren't. I also think you should really focus on what we believe the conservation can do, and how it might make all the difference in the world, and we can get there quickly. And I think on the information order, I think we have to be much clearer about what we hope to gain from it and when it might be useful, and talk about curtailments, because we've done curtailments on the Russian River system. I don't know if we've done them up these creeks before. Have we done them on these creeks last year? Or
No, not on the tributaries so far.
that's where so the challenge of doing curtailments on the creeks, if they're really, you know, you don't have a continuous flow, so you definitely have the conditions for curtailment. So I just think you're going to need to explain this to folks with a lot of humility and apologies in some ways, because it would have been, frankly, I would have been much happier if we had used our list and sent out 10,000 notices when you tried to do it. 650 versus 10,000 people who in a week haven't gotten their notices. This is, from a procedural standpoint, even an emergency, a very uncomfortable place for us to be. I know the intentions are good. I understand the anger. But if we don't act today, my fear is then we don't act for 2 more weeks, and then there's not the time. So there's a fair amount of, I don't know what the right phrase would be, to be eaten. But, you know, I think this is one of the harder decisions that we've had, and I didn't expect that till I came in.
Maybe just to add for a moment here that what if you do proceed today and vote to support moving the regulations on, that this is just a starting point, that the regulations themselves are the beginning of a phased process. Actually, the beginning were the voluntary initiative that went out there. This regulation is the next step, but it's a baby step in many respects. It's asking for information about the water that's being used currently and what's projected to be used. And it's about doing the prudent thing, following on with the statewide conservation restrictions that are currently in place that we just discussed, and adding a little more oomph to them. I know that there are many more ideas in the community because we've heard them here today. And so part of what we'll be gathering when we meet with the community in July is additional information on if this really doesn't work, because as we've said, if it really doesn't work, curtailments may be an option in these tributaries, but there might also be other things that can be done. And we'll hear that, I know, from the community members because we're hearing it now.
We'll definitely focus attention on the conversation. It just, as Mr. Wachecki said, it's going to be we're going to be starting out angry as opposed to folks coming in. It may well be if we didn't do this, people wouldn't come in at all, but it's a very uncomfortable situation to be in.
I just want to reinforce one of your points is that it'll be important to communicate the value of the information and how it benefits the community. It's not just a state accounting process. And I think we have, fortunately, some recent success, some recent great examples of usefulness and customer service. You know, you don't have to use those terms. You figure out a way, but the issue is we have to convey the value added of this process, that we're not just seizing some kind of opportunity through the governor's emergency authorities and that sort of thing, because some people say that and perceive that. But really, that gets to my earlier comment about what's the long-term value of this and how it benefits the local management of the surface and groundwater resources. So I just want to, and I think there's a valid path there, and we have a track record, recent track record, of implementing emergency regulations in this state. And let's give some examples so if people have a sense, oh, okay, this is how it worked in the Delta in February, you know, and how our curtailment analysis was vastly improved. And thanks to some really hard work by the locals and our staff to get good information. How about, you know, and then the Australia example, how that was the guiding light for getting through the drought for Australia, was getting better information on diversions and you know, and the complexity of the water cycle in their river basins. So I just want to throw those ideas out that, you know, why are we doing this? Well, these are the benefits, and here's some examples that we've recently gone through. Thanks.
Prepared for a motion? Okay. So, well, wait a second. I think you had some language that staff was going to show. Okay. On the gray water section.
I think it changes